Our theme, the space between, is very appropriate for what I want to talk about today, the space between generations, from the past through present to future, and how the stories that link them relate to our survival. In the early 1940s, my father, who was a doctor, and his team wanted to reduce the rate of infant mortality in South Africa and match it with the statistics of the first world. As a result, we moved from one place to another, and I grew up in many different ethnic and cultural communities. I was filled with a deep sense of the importance of connectedness and context. I also lived through the turmoil and horror of apartheid. As Kat asked, how many of you are also trauma survivors? Not all of you. I think every one of us, all of us, are trauma survivors. Think back. How many of you are from immigrant families? Not you? Didn't anybody in your family experience immigration, migration, or being refugee? All of our families have a history of displacement. We may define trauma differently. We may be separated from it by generations. But for everyone to be here today in this country, somebody in our family has experienced the trauma of migration and survived. Now, how many of you are trauma survivors? Thank you. I'd like to share with you a story about a young family that I worked with, and their names, Patrick and Anne, in their early 30s, had a delightful young son, Connor, aged 5. Patrick and Anne were really worried because of Connor's behavior problems and his refusal to go to school. Patrick was also very concerned because his drinking had increased since the untimely death of his father from liver cirrhosis. Anne immediately jumped in and said, all of his family are alcoholics. Some died of it, some committed suicide. Patrick teared up, remembering the shame of dragging his grandpa back from the pub and of not being able to bring friends home because his father was passed out drunk. Anne said, I know there is no hope for Connor. Remember, he's 5 years old. Is she right to despair about this little boy? In order to understand, let's go back and explore where Patrick's family comes from, County Cork in Ireland. Imagine Patrick's great-great-grandpa Liam during the time that the English needed additional land to be able to give their gentry titles. They took the land, they took the wealth, they took the food. The Irish were left starving. Patrick and his father worked as hard as they could to feed the family. They were not succeeding. He was the oldest boy of 8 children, several of whom had already died. So his parents scrimped and saved to be able to send him to the land of plenty, where he could make his fortune and send money home to save the rest of the family. They didn't realize they had put their 12-year-old child on a coffin ship. Many of our ancestors came over on death ships just like this. When he arrived, the streets were not paved with gold, and he met the same reception that many of our ancestors in every wave of immigrants experienced. Prejudice, poverty, menial labor, a life as hard as the one he had left, only now he was alone. He worked really hard and saved to send money home. Little Irish kids weren't allowed to be educated by the British, so he had to pay a letter writer with some of his hard-earned money. Those letters took months to go backwards and forwards. He was essentially cut off from his family and everything familiar. Can you imagine how hard it was for this little boy? And he was carrying a huge secret. He couldn't share his misery with anybody in the family back home. They needed the myth of his success to justify their sacrifice. This was the beginning of the family secrets. Many of these young immigrants became so depressed that they committed suicide. Liam didn't. He fought his trauma alone. He started to drink to assuage the grief and loss. When Liam was 15 years old, he married a 14-year-old immigrant, and they started a family together. He knew nothing about how to be a husband or a father. He treated his wife and kids really roughly. How could he have learned parenting skills? He was a child himself. He continued to mask his grief and pain by drinking, and inevitably, 4 of his 6 children became alcoholics. You all know the story from here, right? This is the beginning of a hopeless, dysfunctional family of alcoholics. Are you familiar with our stereotype of the drunken Irish? So easy to judge, isn't it? As a professor of neuropsychiatry and family medicine, the medical model of cause and effect has trained me to look for reasons for problems. So I was determined to start to find out where addiction came from. What I came to understand through my research and 30-plus years of experience with many families from around the globe is that the psychosocial trigger of addiction, suicidality, post-traumatic stress, and mental illness is major trauma and loss. I also learned that this process that appears in what we think are dysfunctional, hopeless families is actually resilience in action. Let me show you how this works. Here we have Liam and the Murphys, his family. This is a genogram, what we use to depict the family tree. Squares are men, circles are women, and the little triangles are miscarriages. The X's represent untimely deaths. And I've used red to depict addiction. Here we have our first addict, Liam. In the next generation, we have his 6 children, 4 of whom are alcoholic, and 1 has committed suicide, 1 died of alcohol. By the 3rd generation, the addiction has spread laterally across the cousins. The Murphys are a classic example. During this time, any attempt to get into recovery is met with relapse. I wanted to know why. Looking at families and collecting their stories from over 100 countries, I was able to collect families who could trace their family histories back 5 to 7 generations. And what I found was that the addiction is actually an adaptive mechanism. It serves to distract the family from their grief while keeping them together because they have to focus on the problems that the addiction causes. This bonding together prevents them from further loss. This is what's happening to our young couple, Patrick and Anne. But they have no idea that Patrick's drinking is in any way related to his family's past trauma. This intergenerational adaptation to trauma is so effective that it gets transmitted down the generations as a way of being without any awareness of what is happening. If someone tries to go into recovery before the grieving is done, the family system is disrupted and immediately the unresolved grief returns in full burden, unconsciously triggering relapse, which triggers reconnection. Somewhere between the third and fifth generation, the addiction starts to subside. So here we have Liam in generation 1, his children, generation 3, and you'll see how the addiction starts to be reduced between generations 3 and 5. You'll also notice that the solid red is being replaced by red outline. These are the people in recovery. Here we have Liam, generation 1, and in my office today is Patrick, generation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In my research, I discovered something really fascinating in all of these families where I'd collected the 5 to 7 generational stories. In every one, there is a diamond-shaped pattern of addiction, regardless of what the trauma is. The diamond with the beginning of Liam spreading across to generation 3 and coming down to Patrick in generation 5. What was also fascinating is that this diamond pattern is absolutely inevitable regardless of what the trauma response is, whether it's addiction or some other way of relieving stress. I call this pattern, so there we have Patrick at generation 5. I call this diamond pattern, this drive to survive, family motivation to change or to heal. This is what I mean by resilience in action. In the natural history of a family, trauma leads to addiction, depression, suicide, post-traumatic stress. These in turn create a prevailing theme of shame, blame, guilt, and despair. Once I understood this process, we conducted a series of federally funded research studies to see whether exposing the secrets, challenging the myths, would allow us to bring about healing at any point. Through intervention, what we discovered was that we don't have to wait 3 to 5 generations. We can intervene at any point in the family history. We can intervene with the first addict, second generation, third generation. We cannot afford the price of waiting 3 to 5 generations. Through intervention, the family is no longer overwhelmed by vulnerability, but aware of their inherent capacity to change, to heal, their resilience. The family now understands that the real underlying dynamic is not weakness and deliberate destruction, but rather resilience and survival. Now, if we think back to Anne and Patrick, Anne no longer is blaming and shaming Patrick, but beginning to see him and understand him in the context of his family story, a story of heroism. This family story is one of adaptation to an impossible situation, a way of being that keeps them together, preventing them from further loss, holding them together so they don't lose anyone, a way of not being wiped out. This is the moment that changes people's lives. The perspective change from despair to hope, the change from shame, blame, guilt, and despair to hope, healing, and health for future generations. The way that we do this with our families is through developing a recovery message with them, a positive revision of their family story. The one that the Murphys developed, their recovery message, is: we have lost too many people through past generations. We cannot afford to lose any more. We now understand that we have overcome overwhelming odds, that we have the family strengths, we have the coping skills. We will bring those with our love and caring to save Patrick, then Connor, and our great-great-grandchildren. And this change in perspective makes all the difference. They now view Patrick and themselves very differently. They all have the energy for change, for recovery, for healing, for preventing any more suffering and loss in future generations. The family now understands that the very things that were not shared across generations for the sake of protection are actually the ones that control their healing power, that can unlock their capacity to save their family. When we understand the past, take responsibility for the present, we can heal the future. The space between is the continuity between generations through story. This is not just the Murphy story, but all of our stories too.